Good morning and welcome, everyone. Our program will begin in 5 minutes.
Good morning, everybody. We're excited to have all of you joining us this morning for the 2021 West Virginia Statewide After School Conference. My name is Susan Gamble, and I serve as the director of the West Virginia Statewide After School Network. The West Virginia After School Network, along with the West Virginia Department of Education, 21st Century Community Learning Centers, and the West Virginia Department of Health and Human Resources Bureau for Children and Families, have partnered together to offer this exciting event. Today and tomorrow, we'll be gathering to hear from national and local experts in the field in after school and youth development. And I'm just so excited to have everybody with us today. It's, continues to be a unique time, and as we're putting these virtual conferences together, and just really appreciate our partners working with us to help provide this event, and appreciative of our speakers that are joining us. So we want to get started this morning first with a couple polls. We'd really like to learn more about who is with us. And so with our first poll, we're going to ask what type of programs we have representing us today. So I think this is, as you'll see, if you could just choose one to give us a little bit of input for our speakers and all the participants as we gather, just to learn a little bit about who will be with us. And I see our numbers are still just changing here a bit. Give everybody just a second to respond about what programs we have with us today. Okay, it looks like we have a lot of childcare providers with us, as well as, of course, 21st CCLC programs, community-based programs, in-home providers. Thank you so much, everybody. We're excited to see those results. All right, and we thought we'd do just one more poll this morning to learn a little bit more about who we have with us today. If we can pull up our next poll, we'd like to learn about your job role. So what is your role at your program? What is it that you do there? Okay, I think our results are still coming in. All right. Oh, we're getting just a couple more results. Give people time to respond. Okay, it looks like we have a lot of administrators and directors with us here today, but of course, site staff, site coordinators, as well as we know we have a lot of professionals that help and work in after school that are working within the school system too. So maybe they couldn't be with us today, but we appreciate that. It gives us some great feedback on who's with us and thinking about not only this event, but providing future events. So we have just a couple items this morning as we get started that are housekeeping items. First, we want to make sure that as you log in, that you have your first and your last name listed. This is especially important if you're getting West Virginia STARS hours, so that we know who is with us today. Also, if you're seeking West Virginia STARS hours, each session has been enrolled separately. And the 2021 West Virginia After School Conference meets the conference requirements for the West Virginia Tier 2 reimbursement application. But it's important that everybody know participants, if you are seeking the conference for Tier 2, are required to complete the conference in its entirety for the conference. So just make that note that everybody is good to go on that. So without further ado, I want to introduce our plenary speakers. Today we have with us Dr. Jill Young and Dr. Michelle Boyd-Brown with us from the American Institutes for Research to talk about the science of thriving. Dr. Jill Young is a senior researcher at the American Institutes for Research. She leads and supports multiple research evaluation, capacity building initiatives focused on youth development and out-of-school time programming at the national, state, and local levels. She previously served as the Senior Director of Research and Evaluation at the Afterschool Matters. And then we also have with us Dr. Michelle Boyd-Brown, who's also a researcher at the American Institutes for Research. She engages in projects on youth development with a focus on science and learning and development, positive youth development, and safe and supportive learning environments. Dr. Boyd-Brown served as a policy fellow for the U.S. House of Representatives Ways and Means Committee, supporting policies and legislation for underrepresented young people and families. All right, thank you, ladies, so much for joining us.
Thank you, Susan. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And make sure I share the right thing. All right. All right. So thank you so much, Susan, for having us. We are just really excited to be here today and just joining West Virginia and meeting all the folks. So as Susan mentioned, my name is Jill Young. I am a senior researcher at the American Institute for Research. And I am here today with my colleague, Michelle Boyd-Brown. And we're going to tell you about the science of learning and development today. We really hope for this to be an engaging discussion, so we encourage you to use the chat box, send questions, and just engage with us throughout this conversation. We'll be making note of the questions that come up through the chat so that we can answer those at the end. And then we're also going to be dropping some resources throughout the presentation that might be useful to you. So I know we kind of did this already, but I would love to get a sense of some of the agencies that are here. I know you guys have been showing your names, but something that we would love to learn about you is, what is your hope or goal for supporting youth and family well-being this year? And go ahead and drop that in the chat for us. Thanks, everyone. Anyone want to share a hope or a goal for supporting young people this year? Helping them to better understand and survive the COVID situation. Yeah, that's a big one. To help kids have a normal year through this uncertain time, to ensure that all bellies and minds are full, reduce stress and increase student resiliency. I hope to find room to collaborate with after-school programs more effectively in the future. I try to help by doing the child's homework so that the parent can spend more quality time. These are great. Thank you guys for sharing. Support families. Thanks, everyone. So a little bit about us. The American Institute for Research, or AIR, we are an independent, nonpartisan, not-for-profit organization, and we do both, we do behavioral and social science research, but we also provide technical assistance, and we work across the country and actually across the globe. So we're quite a big organization. Our mission is to generate and use rigorous evidence that contributes to a better, more equitable world. And within AIR, Michelle's work and my work as well largely sits within a program area called Youth, Family, and Community Development. And that's where all of our after-school work sits. It's also where all of our work related to the science of learning and development sits. So both of us are also members of the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation's After-School Technical Assistance Collaborative. That's a mouthful. Say that 10 times fast, or even 5 times fast. But basically, through that work, we support the 50 statewide after-school networks and their quality efforts, including the West Virginia statewide after-school network. So before we jump into the science of learning and development, we first want to talk about where we've been and kind of share our perspective on how we got here. So here is a really high-level timeline. Since many of you are educators, both inside and outside of school, I think you'll recognize some of these benchmarks in the timeline. So if you look to the left of the timeline, we see a really strong era of accountability and standards. And that era of accountability actually started before No Child Left Behind and kind of fueled No Child Left Behind. So when advocates wanted to start to integrate social and emotional learning into schools, they understood that if that was going to happen in an era of accountability, that it really needed to have a strong evidence base and it needed strong standards to align with, because that was really what was driving education reform in that era. And as we move to the right side of the timeline, we saw how practice leaders, researchers, and policymakers were really trying to take that evidence and information that was created on the left side in response to accountability, take all of that rigorous evidence and really put it into practice and policy. So first, the body of research. And this could be an entire presentation on its own, but that's not what we're here for. So we'll give you the highlights. There were really two pivotal pieces of research that came out in the mid to late 2000s, and they were both part of the same study that is often called the Durlach and Weisberg meta-analysis. How many of you, feel free to answer in the chat box, like how many of you have heard of SAFE before? Is this familiar to anybody? Well, this pivotal study demonstrated that when high quality SEL programs were implemented, oh, we've got one, thanks Patricia. So basically what this study told us is that when high quality SEL programs were implemented in sequenced, active, focused ways, and when they explicitly intended to promote social and emotional well-being, young people benefited. So these kinds of studies, which were really important from a research point of view, tell us that to get the outcomes that you're trying to get and to prove the value of something, they have to be programmed and you had to measure outcomes. So I think for anyone who's worked in after school or been to after school programs or experienced them themselves, we all feel this and know this, even if we haven't read the evidence. So what the evidence tells us is, we saw that these kinds of SEL programs promoted social and emotional competencies, attitudes and behaviors. They improved academic achievement, which we hoped that they would. They promoted on-time graduation from high school and college. And we also saw that there were long-term improvements in employment. And secondly, we saw great decreases in personal challenges and emotional and behavioral issues in schools. We also saw decreased police involvement and lesser involvement in social services like housing and subsidies over time. So this was a body of research that was really heralded and kind of pointed to this need to do SEL in schools. SEL was kind of seen as the missing link in this No Child Left Behind era, where there was all this, quite a bit of testing was going on. And so this movement kind of came in and said that we had to look at programs, we had to look at outcomes in order to really advocate for, this important link that tells us more about how young people learn and develop in their lives. So all of this created a lot of excitement and a lot of definitions. So we have 3 of the more common definitions here on the slide for you. So there is one from the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, or CASEL. We've also got one from Committee for Children and one from the EASL Lab. And all of these definitions, they outline different social and emotional competencies. But what's important to note is that they all use the same word to describe what SEL is. It's a process. So SEL is a process. It's a journey that we all go on naturally, but it can be bolstered by instruction. So we agree that SEL is a process that is bolstered by a set of practices. And as a result, hopefully young people develop competencies like social awareness, self-awareness, relationship skills, teamwork. We've always really loved talking about the competencies. And so did everyone else. So there are several frameworks. Feel free to tell us in the chat if you've heard of any of these or if you've used any of these. But here is CASEL's framework. And we've got character.org's character education framework, Partnership for 21st Century Skills, Foundations for Young Adult Success, Whole School, Whole Community, Whole Child. And feel free to share others in the chat if we didn't mention one that is closer to your work. So these frameworks identified the competencies, but not really the things that educators should do to support social and emotional learning. So we got and get to this day a lot of questions about frameworks, like which framework should we use, or are these frameworks evidence-based, or what aligns most with the assessment tool I want to use. So in 2017, we reviewed 136 frameworks in 20 areas of study across the globe. And if you've grappled with frameworks before, I don't think our results will really surprise you. We found that frameworks did not apply uniformly across individuals, groups, or systems. So what that means is they rarely considered cultural and linguistic differences in individuals and groups. They rarely considered youth with disabilities or youth who had experienced trauma or chronic stress. And they rarely considered the developmental sequence of competencies or developmental stage. So in the end, we were left with these really important frameworks that told us we could influence social and emotional competencies, but they didn't really tell us how to support educators in making sure that young people have the opportunities to develop those skills. So then assessment went wild, and we are all culprits of this, AIR included. So before we knew what to do, we decided to assess how well young people were experiencing their social and emotional development. And it was really hard in my opinion, for educators and young people to make use of that data, since we were still trying to figure out what to do to help young people develop social and emotional competencies. I experienced this myself, actually, when I worked for an after-school program. So we were aligned with a local framework that focused on 21st century skills. And right away, we adopted the framework, and then we had to develop an assessment tool really quickly to start assessing those skills. So we had the framework and the assessment built at the same time and implemented it like probably within a couple of weeks of each other. Basically, the initiative, this might not come as a surprise, was a bit of a bust because a lot of the educators were telling us, well, you haven't really taught me how to do this. Like, you haven't really been explicit in what I'm supposed to do. And you haven't really given me any support to do this. And on top of that, there's no training on how to do this. And so there's this major disconnect between the framework, assessment, and practice. And then we had all these data and we didn't know what to do with it. We couldn't make sense of it because we kind of put the cart before the horse, so to speak. I'm sure many of you have experienced something like that before. So if you think back to the timeline, you'll see where assessment went wild, and it's really on the tail end of No Child Left Behind. So we're on the downswing of assessment, but we're still really used to having to assess things to prove the value of what we're doing. So these organizations and collaboratives were really trying to come in and help respond to that demand ethically. So we also reviewed 126 assessments and found that they varied in their purpose, discipline, and what they assess. So I'm curious how many of you have been asked to assess social and emotional competencies in your work, and feel free to share your experiences in the chat. So what you'll see is this was very similar to what we found with frameworks, kind of like what I mentioned with my personal example. They rarely consider the connection between frameworks, practice, and measurement. So it really wasn't there, or it was there in a very nuanced way and not in a way that someone could just pick it up and run with it. They also didn't really consider use or practitioner burden and ease of use. And this is really important because a lot of these high quality assessments are often really burdensome for both the educator and the young person. And then there were also issues in terms of suitability for culturally diverse groups. And these assessments didn't really take into account cultural assets for youth of color or youth from disadvantaged backgrounds. So we had lots of well-meaning things going on, but also lots of disconnects with what was happening in real life. So meanwhile, in real life, you could put something, whatever you want, into this honeycomb. I think we've all got a million things going on in a given day, especially nowadays. There's new trends, new programs, new initiatives. We've got reopening guidance, reconnection and re-engagement efforts. And sometimes it's really hard to sort out what's going on, given whatever you're dealing with on any day. And so sometimes when you have a moment, it's not really surprising that it's kind of hard to make sense out of all of this in practice.
Thank you, Jill. And so I'll pivot now to talking about what do we know now. And before I transition to the next slides, I'm going to drop a few things in the chat box that you all can refer to and you all can look at in your own time or even as I'm speaking, but there are things that will come up as we're going through the rest of the slides. So hopefully everyone can see them. If you can't, let me know and I can always resend them, or we can find another way to get them to you. So one thing we first wanted to point out is the work of the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development, also known as the SEED Commission. So if you've heard that term, then it's the same group that I'm referring to. The SEED Commission was convened by the Aspen Institute, and it was intentionally a short duration commission. It was co-chaired by policy, practice, and research professionals, but it was also, their work was driven by voices in the field. So as far as the people who were involved, there were over 24 different scholars and leaders who served as commission leaders, or excuse me, commission members, but then there are also at least 75 different scientists, educators, youth, and parents who participated in various councils and panels that then informed the work of the council, or excuse me, the commission. And this commission, a big part of their work was developing recommendations for whole child approaches. So one thing that they really advocated for is that we have a broader conception and a broader vision for how we define education, and really education that focuses on the whole child. And this will involve more comprehensive approaches to the way that we promote learning and development in the way that we educate young people. This work also included using science to demonstrate the linkages between and among the social, emotional, cognitive, and the academic dimensions of learning. So that integrated model, an integrated understanding of all these elements are important when it comes to overall learning and development for young people. And you'll see the slide here that we highlight 6 of those recommendations that the SEED Commission came up with. So some of the things that we will highlight here is the piece around supporting adult capacity, but then also aligning resources. So better coordination and collaboration across systems, across settings that young people live, work, and play. But really an important piece of that is leveraging the partnerships that we have. And I think this will come up again when we talk more about ecosystem thinking and ecosystem approaches. So thinking about all the settings, all the spaces, all the adults that young people interact with, and their roles in supporting young people's learning and development. Next, when we go to the next slide, I'm going to refer back to that point I just made about the SEED Commission recommendation about a partnership. So this slide here really emphasizes the point that partnering is important within an ecosystem that a young person is developing. So we're considering, like I said, all the settings where young people live, where they work, and where they play. So that's after school, that's workplaces, especially as young people transition into adolescence and then even transition into young adulthood, be going into their employment space. And then as it relates to higher education, and definitely we don't want to undersell the importance of connecting and partnering with families and considering what happens in the home context for young people. So this is just an illustration of all the different spaces and places that we need to consider when we think about young people's learning and development. So now as we transition to the science of learning and development and what the science says, I want to point out that there were some really key scholars and researchers who were involved in the development or the impetus of the, not necessarily the science, but the fact that using the science and synthesizing the science and elevating the science as a unified body of knowledge. So scholars and researchers, including David Osher, Pam Cantor, and Linda Darling-Hammond, some people may have heard of these folks, but they collaborated to publish a paper to elevate the evidence base around issues of student engagement and really whole child learning and development. So they wrote a paper and they brought together multiple disciplines. And they referred to this paper and called the paper The Science of Learning and Development. So sometimes you'll hear Jill and I and others who work in this space refer to it as SOLD. So if you hear me say SOLD, I'm just referring to the science of learning and development. And then also the work of the SOLD Alliance, which I'll explain in a bit here. But this paper I want to mention and link it back to the SEED Commission. So this paper informed the work of the SEED Commission. I don't want you all to think that all these things are separate and they don't have influences on each other. So SOLD is definitely embraced in the SEED Commission recommendations, especially given that through line around whole child development and whole child approaches. And even out of the growth, one of the outgrowths of this paper and the work that David, Pam, and Linda did was a broader group formed by the different organizations represented here. So for instance, David is from AIR, Linda Darling-Hammond is from Learning Policy Institute, and Pam Cantor is for Turnaround for Children. But then they brought in other partners to help elevate and pursue this work. So this broader group was formed and referred to as the SOLD Alliance. And the goal is to really ensure that SOLD is further, or was further, and continues to be further translated into the research spaces, into practice spaces, and also into policy. So what are the disciplines that inform SOLD? Here, you see an array of disciplines, an array of places that's studied. And just, as far as our participation, since we want you all to be actively engaged in this conversation, I'm curious who studied any of these disciplines? I want you to note, in the chat box, if you affiliated with any of these disciplines, if you studied these disciplines, also if you just studied, not necessarily in the traditional sense, but you've come across podcasts, articles, research, training that helps you dig a little bit deeper on one of these topics. But one of the things I want to elevate is that this is not new science or new revelations. Much of it has already been lifted. Like I said, there's instances where people have gone through training to learn more about social and emotional learning or human development, or they actually studied it in school. But I'm just curious what people have studied in this as far as this space. So I see education, elementary education has popped up, social and emotional learning. So you see that you already are very much familiar with these things. So it's not new to you, and it's not new things that we're necessarily teaching. But one of the disciplines that really stands out in this figure is neuroscience. So over time, there's been an increasing interest, there's been increasing knowledge, and really a sophistication of the tools that we use to really understand neuroscience. And when you think about the development and the advancement of brain scans, and really this increased interest and knowledge and sophistication of the tools and resources we have to understand neuroscience have really promoted opportunities to continue building the evidence base around brain development and what we know about how the brain develops. And in this evolution of what we know concerning neuroscience and brain development, we've especially learned a lot more about brain development during the adolescence years and how critical this developmental period is for learning and development. So like I mentioned, there's some things that I put in the chat. One thing I wanted to plug is a series of videos and a series of resources on youth.gov focus on the power of the adolescent brain. And you have a researcher, Dr. Frances Jensen, who does neuroscience work, who talks about the opportunities and the promise and experiences that happen in adolescence when it comes to brain development. So if you have a chance to check that out, that's just another resource. And then when we transition to this next space, we really want to highlight the findings that are elevated in SOLD. As I mentioned, it's building on all these other disciplines. This is not new information, but these are some of the highlights or the takeaways that you'll often hear in the discussions around the science of learning and development, and also things elevated by the SOLD Alliance. So the first is potential. What we're trying to elevate here or illustrate here is that all young people have the potential to learn and thrive. And I want to emphasize all young people in all conditions. There really is opportunities to learn and thrive, and they're influenced by the work that we do with them and the conditions and the opportunities and the support that we provide to young people. And then there's the issue of malleability. There's great opportunity, especially in adolescence, but also other developmental periods to influence learning and development. Let's focus on adolescence for a bit. Adolescents are primed for learning. The way that their brain develops, they are actively seeking learning opportunities. Their emotions are even more heightened. But this is really a great time to teach them about decision-making skills. It's really a great time to give them that prefrontal cortex assist for them to help them think about the causes and consequences of the decisions they make. But it's also a great time to encourage them to take positive risks. So not everything that happens in as far as adolescence and what's happening during that period is negative. So just as much as we can talk about the risk-taking, the negative risk-taking, we should also be elevating that young people are also taking positive risks during this developmental period. In the same way we talk about learning as it relates to addiction, there's also a prime opportunity for teaching and learning that's not necessarily related to the negative aspects. Then there's relationships. Given the earlier point, it's really important to think about the intentional developmental relationships and creating safe environments. And when I say safe settings, not just fairly physical safety, but thinking about identity safety, psychological safety, emotional safety. Those settings can really buffer the impacts of trauma and toxic stress on the brain, because we know when there is trauma and when there is toxic stress, It impacts young people's learning, or impacts all people's learning, and also their brain chemistry. And yes, this puts a lot of responsibility on the adults and the other people who are in the lives of young people. And then transitioning to some other points, context matters. This includes the relationships. Contexts are really a defining influence, and those relationships are really a defining influence on young people. And some other elements that we have here are related to individuality and continuum. Development is individual. Everyone has a unique developmental journey. There's a lot of variation for young people. Early in my career, I worked at an early childhood center. And when you think about this, there's others who are probably on the call who have also now working in early childhood centers. But when you think about it, or even if you work in a classroom, when you're in a room with children of all the same or very similar ages, you begin to recognize the progression that young people have, but you also begin to appreciate the immense variation in how they learn and develop, whether that's like the pacing of their development, the timing of their development, the executing of certain developmental tasks, whether, and we'll talk about younger children, whether it's from walking, feeding themselves, being potty trained, or if we make it more personal, if you think about your own, maybe your own children, families, nieces, nephews, loved ones. When we see those children in our lives at different time points, they might be having the similar or same experiences. A 3-year-old child, your first child who's 3 may behave differently than maybe your second child when they were the same age. So it's really trying to make sure that people understand the unique developmental journeys that young people go through. And the last one we'll touch on is integration and meaning making. So when it comes to integration, it goes back to one of my earlier points, that social and emotional aspects cannot be divorced from learning and development. All are intertwined. These social, emotional, cognitive, and academic elements are all intertwined, all interconnected and integrated. And so our approaches have to come with that same lens and framework. And the last piece, as far as meaning making, is really critical for long-term development and learning. So for instance, being more likely to retain knowledge, skills, and competencies over time is something really resonates with your lived experience, or you had a really impactful hands-on experience. And this is relevant for all types of learning, whether it's social, emotional, or academic. And so per some of the earlier points that Jill made, where she laid out all the different frameworks that we've heard of, and the different things that have come up as far as frameworks, SOLD is not a framework. SOLD really is a body of evidence that can inform our work, whether we use a framework or not. SOLD is one of the best ways to describe SOLD is that it's knowledge to support and bolster what we're doing to support young people. So it's not a framework, but it's really elevating the knowledge and having all the different disciplines informing that knowledge and all the best things that we know, our best knowledge at this point around learning and development. So to reiterate some of the earlier points, all youth have the potential to thrive. Then all youth also have different developmental pathways. When you go to the next slide, which is like, and then relationships and context are primary to learning and development. They really are drivers. So this is just reiterating some of the things that I just mentioned. One thing I also want to point out is that practices are important. The SOLD Alliance has really elevated principles and associated practices. So when you think about the body of knowledge, some people might then say, so what do I do now? What you see on the screen is what we sometimes call the blue wheel. But pretty much it's the principles and practices that we elevate that align with the science of learning and development. So we can enhance learning and development. We form positive developmental relationships, and we're creating the conditions that are safe and supportive and foster a sense of safety. Like I mentioned, all safety or all forms of safety, and a sense of belonging. When we provide rich learning experiences and opportunities, and we are intentionally building knowledge and fostering the development of productive skills, productive habits, productive mindsets, and giving young people intentional opportunities to practice those skills, habits, and mindsets, and then also to model them. We also know we can enhance learning development when we're intentional about providing students and family-driven integrated support systems that reduce or also eliminate barriers to learning and development, but also integrated support systems that avoid stigmatizing young people or labeling young people and their families. One thing I wanted to also mention that I laid out in the chat box, or shared in the chat box, is that these are further articulated in recently released design principles playbooks. So I think these are great tools that just came out within the last month that the SOLD Alliance put out. There's one for schools that was primarily authored by the Learning Policy Institute and Turnaround for Children in partnership with other SOLD Alliance partners. And then one focused on community-based settings that was chiefly authored by the Forum for Youth Investment. So these tools help answer the question, what do I do to be aligned with the principles of SOLD? What are the actual practices? With great illustrations, case studies, examples. So just to pause for a bit, I'm really curious, like, because a lot of these things are probably familiar to all of you, how do you put these findings into your practice currently? What things resonate with you? What things did you hear when we're going over SOLD that you say, you know what, relationship building is really important, or I try to make sure that there's these intentional opportunities to provide X, Y, and Z. So just in the chat box, if you could take a bit to let us know, how do you put these findings into your practice currently? And if some of you are putting those things in there, I just want to make sure we move forward a little bit, but I still welcome you to add those things. I'm going to take a bit of a brain break on the next slide, right? And let you all stop and read a quote from Dr. Pam Cantor about the brain and about brain development. So we've thrown a lot at you. So this is a bit of your brain break to be able to pause a bit and read over it. And I really want to know, you know, even in addition to sharing some of the other responses we just asked for, but if you could even share your responses in the chat box on how this quote resonates with you. What does it mean to you? What does it say to you when you read these pieces? And I appreciate all the things that folks are mentioning in the box. I see a lot about relationship building, social experiences. I would say, you know, even building that rapport with families and young people, and acknowledging that all youth, excuse me, have the ability to learn and thrive. I love that. So as we transition to the next slide, let's just pause for a bit also, and you can continue the discussion in the chat, but also let us know what relevance does the SOLD, or the Science of Learning and Development, hold for us amid our current realities. As Susan mentioned at the start, we have a lot of things going on right now as far as when we're trying to support young people, whether it's issues of school reopening, re-engagement efforts, still grappling with the effects of the COVID pandemic and the change in just the way people have to live right now. So just continue as we transition, or continue our presentation to just share what relevance you feel like SOLD holds for us amid our current realities. And I'll turn it over to you, Jill, for the next piece.
Thanks, Michelle. So what's next? We threw a lot of information at you. And so what do we do with all of this information? Well, first, we are super excited to see that the U.S. Department of Ed's recently released COVID-19 handbook reflects a lot of what we know to be true about how young people learn and develop. And so there's a lot of stuff related to the importance of after school, the science of learning and development, and we're really excited about that. So some of the recommendations that came out of it include partnering with youth and families to make sure that schools and the associated programs are inclusive and supportive of family needs. There's a big focus on flexibility in terms of partnerships, funding, and all sorts of things to really increase access. There's also a focus on providing real tangible benefits to young people. Relationships, no surprise there. There's a lot of focus on relationships, and it sounds like a lot of you are already doing that. And then there's also a focus on including opportunities for enrichment that foster social, emotional, and academic development. Again, getting at that idea that those things are connected. They're not divorced from each other, as Michelle said. And then leveraging programs that already exist and have demonstrated results. So including community organizations that are already rooted in the community, already have a history with youth and families, and then focusing on assessment and evaluation to really support continuous improvement. So here's what I think is kind of great. This slide may as well be talking about after-school programs already. This is what we do. and the science of learning and development, and all of the evidence that we've described just confirms a lot of what we already know to be true. So I find that to be really reassuring and kind of a neat thing that we now have a body of evidence that really supports what we already knew in practice, and knew from our own experiences.
And so now I know we're closing out soon as far as our formal presentation, but we will have a question and answer portion. But I'm curious if folks, in addition to the wonderful things you've already shared about the different principles and practices you elevate in your work, I'm also hoping that you can share with us what matters most right now for your programs and the young people, the families and the communities that you support. And then also, what do you need to help young people thrive? I think these are really important questions, especially ones that can be informed by the science and informed by the body of knowledge that we have through the science of learning development and related work. And so we're just curious as far as what matters most right now for you, but then also what you need to help the young people and the families and the communities that you're supporting and that you're living in. I think things about resources being a big help. Thank you for sharing that point. Any other thoughts about what matters most right now for your programs and the young people and the families that you all are working with? Okay, creating connections, very important. I also feel like that resonates with some of the earlier things that people were sharing, where they're really elevating the importance of relationship building, whether it's with educators, with parents, with families, and with young people. Building trust. I feel like these things are always important, but even more so now in the context that we're living in. Families and children knowing that they're supported, building relationships with families. Again, the points about the need being resources for staff. And kudos for also pointing out, yes, the need for your programs more than ever. You're right, definitely feeling a big need. I want people to feel encouraged to continue sharing, but now as we transition to our last slide and to the question and answers, we wanted to end by saying we know it is a lot of responsibility and maybe a sense sometimes of being overwhelmed, knowing the influence that we have when we ally and when we work with young people, and also trying to create those conditions for their learning and development. But also we want you to leave with knowing that there's really great excitement and hope in knowing that we can support all young people, emphasis on all, and we can support their learning and development, and we can really be positive about the opportunities to help all young people, especially when we have this knowledge and this body of knowledge and this information to really bolster the work that we're doing. So on the last slide, we've shared our contact information. Feel free to reach out to me and Jill. And now we'll transition to questions. I believe I turn it over to you, Susan, right?
Sure, thank you both. Such powerful and important information. We want to encourage everybody, if you have any questions, that you feel free to share those in the Q&A section, and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. Also, any additional information that if we need to jump off, we can continue to share in the forum online on the website. We do have a question. Are there any special considerations from SOLD on adolescents?
I know we touched on this briefly during the conversation about the great opportunities and experiences, especially for that particular developmental period. I also want to take the time to also elevate some other work done by the National Academies, where they recently published a consensus study and consensus work called The Promise of Adolescence, and I feel like can greatly articulate the things that are happening for young people. They really focus on the onset of puberty, going into mid-20s. So when you think about adolescence and then also the transition into young adulthood, and they point out the different ways in which and why it's a particularly critical period of development. So as I had mentioned before around neuroscience, so the brain maturation, brain development that's happening during this particular developmental period, but then also the positive risk taking. So all the opportunities that young people have to discover new experiences, new relationships, new opportunities, and also to develop those relationships with other people, so that increasing social and emotional development, especially if they're gaining more autonomy. So this is really important as far as thinking about the types of supports young people need, and that sharing and partnering with them, and the sharing of power in their decision making, and helping them to be able to find their voice, and elevate their voice, and elevate their perspective and goals and for their future. I think there's also elements that's really important when it comes to identity development that's happening during adolescence, and how critical and salient identity development is for young people. But then also the resilience that young people have, and especially during adolescence, that can really still, as we mentioned with the malleability, we still have an opportunity to influence their lives and address issues of toxic stress and trauma, and really make sure that they're on a trajectory towards thriving, and on a trajectory towards reaching their own individual and unique potential.
We have another question. What does SOLD look like in practice?
This is a good one. We get this one quite a bit, actually. Like, this is great. What do we do with it? How does this fit into the stuff that we're already doing? So the good news is that there are a lot of folks that are really thinking about this, and I'm happy to say that AIR is one of them. We're really trying to find ways to translate what all of this good research says. What does that mean for people who are doing the work? What does that mean for policy? What does that mean for practice? So there are a few good resources, and Michelle, I think, dropped some of them into the chat, and we'll make sure that we share those again. Those are related to trying to see what this looks like for community-based programs. So we talked to a number of youth-serving organizations and tried to really figure out how the science of learning and development aligned with what they were already doing, and found that it was a really nice fit. So we have a series of what we call vignettes that kind of describe in more detail what the science of learning and development looks like in practice at a youth serving organization. And then we also have a brief that kind of walks through each of those 5 spokes on the blue wheel, the blue practice wheel. So developing positive developmental relationships, integrated support systems, all that stuff. And then the most recent resource is comes from the SOLD Alliance, their playbook. And so what's cool about that is it has all of the SOLD research in one spot. And it also has a really neat, I think it's neat, self-reflection tool for each of the practices for you to think about, am I doing this already? Am I not? How am I feeling about how this is going? So I think to me, that's kind of like just starting with that reflection piece is really helpful. And I think the thing that I like to remind anybody when they're thinking about, okay, well, what's next is, like Michelle said, it's not a framework. So it's not something new. And I think you'll find that it probably aligns nicely with your quality frameworks, your quality standards that you may be using. Definitely aligns with whole child development and SEL frameworks. It probably aligns really well with what you're already doing. And it just, the first step would really be just taking a step back and reflecting on what you're doing and what you want to focus on and move forward. And that playbook has, like I said, a really great reflection tool to help you do that.
And I tried to also repost in the chat the things that Jill mentioned. So the work that we did talking to different youth serving organizations around how they're putting SOLD into practice in the community brief, and then also the design principles. And we're lucky because one is focused on schools and the other one is really focused on community-based settings. Again, to that ecosystem thinking that all the places and spaces where young people are important.
Right. Thank you for sharing those resources there in the chat again. We did have a question come in about resources for public libraries. So certainly access those resources listed in the chat, but is there anything additional that you guys would want to mention for public libraries?
We're happy to, I saw a couple of questions come up about sharing the slides, and we're happy to do that.
Fantastic. We had another question in the chat. How are you identifying those for your after-school programs? Is it open enrollment? And do you try to take in those who are considered in a low socioeconomic status? And how do they get to your facility? And how do they get home? So I'm not sure if everybody can see that. We might have some other participants from across the state that might want to respond to those questions there in the chat, as well as in terms of thinking about that within a SOLD framework. Okay, how about another question? What does it mean to have identity affirming or identity safe spaces?
Right, this is another thing we probably didn't get a chance to touch on as much as we would want in the conversation, but I know we've said it so many times, but I mean, I think the playbooks are really great because in general, the SOLD Alliance and the principles that are elevated by the SOLD Alliance elevate issues of safety. So as I mentioned, safety is, we often hear that word and we think of physical safety, but there's, in addition to physical safety, there's going to be identity safety and making sure that we're creating spaces that are culturally responsive, but also culturally relevant, and they're also culturally affirming. And not only just the setting, but the experiences in those settings, the way that content is delivered, the way we engage with families, all those things should have a clear cultural responsiveness and a cultural affirmation embedded within them. And making sure that, you know, the folks who are engaging with children and youth and families have that competencies and those skills to be able to engage from a level of cultural responsiveness and affirmation. And then, you know, we point to the playbook again because it also talks about how to create those environments where you're fostering inclusivity. And there's even a good section around culturally responsive pedagogy and culturally responsive teaching, especially in I'm now referring to the school's playbook. But those are elements there that can further flesh out and articulate how do we create those spaces that are responsive and affirming to the different identities and cultures that are embedded within our communities and within our programs, and then, you know, the identities and cultures of the students that we work with.
I also just like to say it's just, I mean, it's not as easy as, but it's, you know, to put it simply, it's allowing youth to be who they are and celebrating that.
All right, I don't see any other questions that have come in right now, but I just want to thank you both so much for joining us today. What a tremendous opportunity to have this presentation as a part of our conference here in West Virginia, and just really appreciate the support that you are providing to us through the After-School Assistance Technical Program. So before we transition on today, just a couple of items. Following this session, we'll be taking a 15-minute break. And then we want to invite everybody to join us back here for 2 concurrent workshop sessions. Remember that we'll be coming back at 10:15 and then again at 11:30. Be sure to check out the on-demand video library on the conference website. And then before we end today, we want to share a video from our sponsor, Mizzen. The Mizzen app is a tremendous, valuable free resource. If you're not familiar with Mizzen, we encourage you to learn about it and to download the Mizzen app. And here in just a minute, we're going to share a video to provide you a little bit more information, as well as if you aren't familiar with Mizzen and would like to learn more, you might want to participate in the Roadmap to Quality and After School session being offered at 11:30. So again, we just thank everybody for joining us here today. And as I said, we'll have our concurrent workshop. You'll just go, just like you did this session, you'll just go back to the website and connect to a workshop through there. And then we will be all back here for a second plenary tomorrow morning, again at 9 a.m. Thanks, everybody.
The life-changing work of educating young people has never been more important. Educators and those who support them know that after-school programs are key to inspiring and engaging young people today and as they look to the future. Mizzen by Maude can help. Mizzen provides age-appropriate content so you can easily find captivating, engaging activities in STEM, arts, and literacy, and so much more. To meet the needs of this moment, Mizzen also offers activities that can be done at home or in small group settings to support and nurture learning wherever children are. Mizzen also provides tools for scheduling, organizing, and communicating with your team. Another key feature is Pro Tips, which provides fresh ideas, news, and advice from industry experts. Mizzen is dedicated to those who want to inspire young people to love learning. And through support from the Mott Foundation, it's completely free. Download Mizzen today.
Thank you, everybody. And I do just want to quickly highlight that Barbie Little had shared there in the chat regarding the Leap into Science sessions for tomorrow. If you do have an interest in participating in those, we would ask that you sign up for those sessions ahead of time. And also Maggie shared a lot of information there in the chat on Mizzen as well that you might want to check out. As I said, it's a completely free resource to after school and summer learning providers and a really great tool. So if everybody can take a quick break and join us here back at 10:15. Thanks so much. Have a good day.